This is Restless. Welcome back to Restless. This is your friendly postmortem on the young, restless, and informed. I am your host, Matt. I am joined by Pastor Michael. Pastor Michael, the thaw has begun.
It has begun. It's actually been really pleasant here in Wisconsin lately. We've had some really solid weather, a lot of sun. It's just been nice. It feels good. And so it seems like it's going to bring the best out in all of us, hopefully.
That's right. So the end of winsome winter may soon come to an end, but we still have a lot to look ahead to. And so as we think about what is coming down the pike this year, we thought it would be helpful to even think about as the Young Restless Reformed exists still as a dominant force in evangelicalism, and many of the leaders are still around. But as we've all know, the divisions between them are growing. And so we are once again joined by our friend who probably would not want to be called an expert on this because he is an actual sociologist who understands how expertise in these fields actually works. But we are joined by Brad Vermurlen, once again, the author of The Reformed Resurgence, who we've interviewed a few times. Welcome back, Brad.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Brad, we have a few more listeners than when we first interviewed you. So would you just quick let the folks know just about the book you wrote and why we have gotten the chance to talk to you a few times?
Certainly, yeah. As you said, I'm a sociologist by profession. I earned my PhD at Notre Dame in sociology, and my dissertation, the book-length project that I wrote to earn my PhD, was on the New Calvinist movement, the Young Restless Reformed. The first, as far as I understand, the first academic kind of non-confessional treatment on the movement. So that eventually ended up getting revamped a little bit and actually published as a book with Oxford University Press called Reformed Resurgence, and the subtitle is The New Calvinist Movement and the Battle Over American Evangelicalism. So that came out in 2020. So after that came out, I've been able to talk with you guys a few times about the movement.
Yeah, Brad has also talked to some other people. He's talking to Aaron Wren. You can find various interviews with him and discussions of his book everywhere.
And should we say, you kind of have some theory about, the different reasons for the YRR or how it came about. And Tim Keller himself even said in an interview, this is maybe my paraphrase, but he basically said, yeah, Brad's right. Brad was right. Like, this is what we were doing in founding the Gospel Coalition and other things like that. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, he did say that. The theory of the book essentially is that the movement has less to do about a numerical increase in Calvinists in America than it does with all sorts of other kind of more harder to grasp cultural dynamics, social dynamics. So that's why the book's about a battle over American evangelicalism, and the idea is that this new Calvinist movement placed itself on the landscape in order to kind of reclaim evangelical orthodoxy in a broader field that was going in all different directions.
Right, and obviously, what's unique about Brad, your research into it, and the perspective you bring to it. While people like Tim Keller say Brad was right or these kinds of things, you're not coming at it primarily as a Christian theologian. You're not coming at it, or as a, I don't know what the right word to say, as a participant so much. Maybe that's not the right way to put it.
Right. It's I'm a Christian, but I'm also a sociologist, and this book was written in my capacity as a sociologist, as a social scientist. So I don't make it's not a religious book by any means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as we continue to think about, for those of all of our listeners who care about the evangelical field, which is just the sociologist way of saying like evangelicalism, we're thinking about the ways that we want to think a little bit about today, about the ways we see these groups of people continuing to divide out, right? Because the the happy time Michael and I remember when all of the Calvinists were all together, all on one big happy team, is
one big coalition,
One big
all
coalition.
together
Together
for
for
the
the
gospel.
Yeah, these things, we were going to have the kind of unity you would expect the church to have in Acts 29, the 29th chapter, when there was one, unified church. Those days have long passed, but it's not that the leaders and a lot of these institutions are gone. It is just that it seems that once again different lines are being drawn up against them, amongst them. And Brad, a few months ago, he tweeted a thread about the kind of new formations of, I don't know what and we'll let Brad tell us, alliances or kind of groupings people are starting to drop themselves into. And we just thought, because Brad has, as obviously before, he had spent years of his life studying the formation of New Calvinism, it might be helpful to just hear this kind of thing that he sees forming in front of us. And now, again, whether or not that will hold long term, I thought it was interesting, and I think everyone else will too. So,
Right. Yeah. So the Young Restless Reformed was always kind of a label that not many people wanted to embrace as like, their own group. It was a kind of a journalistic label, and same with New Calvinism. I mean, it was something that people would talk about, but nobody really wanted to. Some people did. They say, "Yeah, I'm a New Calvinist" or whatever. Or they would say, "I run in YRR circles," but the label has, I think, become less important than it was, 2010, 2012, 2014. So as you guys well know, it's kind of, it doesn't coalesce as well as it used to. And I pointed toward this at the end of my book a few years ago, that this was kind of, the writing was on the wall that this was happening. But the tweet thread that you mentioned it's not just about how the Young Restless Reformed has broken into multiple groups. It was actually about American evangelicalism as a whole has broken into multiple groups or expressions. Only a couple of them, I think, would encompass what used to be the Young Restless Reformed.
Because in your book, you mentioned the other expressions of evangelicalism that the New Calvinists were kind of competing with, even kind of back at the time, right?
That's right.
There were multiple even at that time.
That's right. And some of those groups I would still say are, kind of identifiable as those same groups.
Okay.
So in this 7-point typology I tweeted out, some of those are still the same as what I talked about in my book. Others have adjusted a little bit.
And obviously, and you can tell me if you're wrong, it seems like one of the ones that maybe has gone through maybe some of the most adjustment has been the New Calvinists, right? Will that prove out in the 7 groups or no?
Yes, especially because New Calvinism isn't one of the 7, right? It's
yeah.
So yeah, in the book it was one of the main identifiable tribes of American evangelicalism, and now I would say we need other labels or categories to make sense of what we see.
Right. Well, if there is a young person studying sociology who wants to get a PhD, they could probably, in sociology of religion, they could head this direction with it. So, but Brad, why don't we start with some of the descriptions of these groups? Is the best term groups, tribes? What kind of term do you think best labels these
types? I'd say
types. Okay.
Types or kinds of American evangelicals. Yeah.
Right.
But that's not to say that every kind of American evangelical who I think would fit in these kinds or types would even know the labels I use or place themselves knowingly in these categories. So it's kind of an outsider's perspective on kind of imposing labels on the landscape, if that makes sense.
It's descriptive. It's not it's not, it's not necessary, right? It's not like, right, we identify as Reformed Presbyterians. These aren't things these terms and types aren't necessarily things people identify as.
Right. Some might lean that way, but others aren't. And I also want to say before I describe them that the language I use and the kind of the categories I'm using, I'm speaking in my capacity as a social scientist, as a social and cultural analyst, and not, as somebody who's trying to be a church leader or like a leader in the evangelical church. So if I use labels or like I'll talk about progressive evangelicals, that's a phrase I'm using as a social scientist and not trying to make any kind of theological statement.
Mm-hmm. Sure. It's not you can on this show, or we won't, you can leave the value judgments to us on them. But yeah, I mean, again, we'll get there when we get there, but I do think that potentially is one that there are people who actually would just readily identify with progressive
Right, and
evangelicals.
That's the first of the 7, actually.
Oh, great. Let's start there. I
just call them progressive evangelicals. And I'm talking about leaders and kind of lay people these are people who, in some notable way, are deviating from Christian thought, traditional thinking on either doctrines of points of theology or ethics. So these might be people who are pro-choice or who are in favor of redefining the institution of marriage to include gay and lesbian couples, or it might be people who think that various forms of sex outside of marriage are fine. Doctrinally, it could be people who deny the fallen condition of humanity or atonement theory altogether and want to re-narrate the Christian story.
Mm-hmm.
And we probably could think of examples of these types of Christians, but I would call those. But for some reason, they also want to stay within the evangelical orbit and kind of interject themselves into evangelical conversations. So that's why they would kind of be within evangelicalism, because they really seem to be persistently a part of the ongoing conversation of evangelicalism.
So that's actually really helpful. Obviously, we're going to be very, very, very different than these people in general, but basically, right, they believe there needs to be some kind of adjustment or progress in the understanding of the Christian faith, but they want to remain in the evangelical field because they want to be part of that conversation. That's what's most interesting about what what you're saying,
and influence it, right? Like I'm already thinking of different groups or people that like they clearly are deviating significantly from what maybe not long ago would have considered kind of the standard beliefs, while they're still there trying to kind of influence things in one particular direction.
Absolutely, yes, and that's why they're not just like mainline Protestantism or something like an old PCUSA person or somebody who has kind of beliefs that deviate significantly from the historic doctrines or ethics of the Christian religion, but they're very much trying to be part of the evangelical conversation. Yeah.
Is in your tweet, did you give any example of either person or any group for this type? And if you didn't, that's fine.
Yeah,
I think okay.
I mean, I don't know how much Rob Bell still tries to be a part of the evangelical conversation, but he'd be somebody who's trying to reinvent some things. David Gushee, he's a Christian ethicist who has deviated on the issue of sexuality. I mean, just think back to the emerging church days. People like Brian McLaren, Tony Jones, Doug Pagitt are all trying to significantly re-narrate what it means, re-narrate the Christian story entirely. So you can think of this kind of as like the what's left over of the more progressive expressions of the emerging conversation.
The group, the Twitter account I think of is the New Evangelicals, which is very interesting. They whoever's running that, I don't know if it's one person or multiple, but it's interesting. They reject a lot of, they want to revise a number of historic beliefs, but right there, we are going to be the new evangelicals. So it's just very interesting. To me, it just kind of demonstrates what Brad is talking about.
Yeah, and one wonders why they want to do that, and not just go join their local UCC church or something.
It does seem like there are plenty.
This is a question we ask all the time, by the way. I was literally just in a conversation a couple of days ago talking about this, that there are folks that you just wonder, like, for instance, even just denominationally, this is a little bit different, but it's, I think, analogous to thinking about evangelicalism in the whole. But there are times when it's like, hey, there are people, for instance, in the Presbyterian Church in America, where I pastor, who clearly have beliefs that are deviating from our standards that would be perfectly at home in many other denominations, right? Like in agreement with other denominations on those particular issues. And the question is, why don't you just go there instead of trying to change the whole rest of the denomination? And so you see that same kind of play in evangelicalism as a whole. There is these who just say, no, I'm staying here and we're moving my way, instead of just going to join what already exists.
That's right. Yeah. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
Yeah. It's going to be a continuing dynamic in evangelicalism. Well, we still have 6 other groups to get to. Let's go to your second type of evangelicals.
Right. So this is a new one that's not talked about in the book, actually. And I guess you could call them identity grievance evangelicals. These are people who are probably, they will tend to be doctrinally a little more on the right path. They might be able to affirm the Westminster Confession or the Baptist Faith and Message, technically, for example. But at the same time, these are people who tend to view their religion through the lens of an identity rather than their various identities through the lens of their religion, whether that be sexuality or gender or race. Those are usually the big 3. So they might doctrinally still be on board with these kind of what we might think of as standard confessions, but they also they're obviously these are what would be called the woke evangelicals. So people who have really, while they might affirm the doctrinal statements, they've bought in entirely to identity politics, especially from a position of perceived victimization or grievance.
And now that we're in 2023, woke has kind of become a pejorative. However, I don't know how, it wasn't too many years ago that Eric Hallelujah Silver Mason wrote Woke Church with a preface by Ligon Duncan, right? This was a thing that was being this alignment was done very intentionally by many leaders in evangelicalism. And I know now that people don't like the label, but it is what it is.
Yeah, so I would say that's kind number 2 of evangelicals. Again, both leaders and ordinary lay people that we can kind of see if you're paying attention to the field.
Yeah, great. Michael, do you have any other thoughts or questions on number 2, or we should continue?
No, it's helpful. This is when we were talking about progressive evangelicals, I was trying to think through. I know there are a lot of people I can think of in various, more doctrinally conservative denominations, who I want to almost put in the progressive evangelical spot, but they would still say, no, I hold to these doctrinal truths, but this helps me because it gives me a category of, no, this is what they're doing, right? Pushing in a different direction, and saying it as they look at the religion through the lens of their identity first, rather than the other way around. I think that's a really helpful lens to see it.
Yeah, I think that, again, this is why I think having Brad's observations on these will just help people understand kind of where these things are, right? That not everyone who has taken some of the assumptions of identity politics are progressives, right? Because it just puts words to things that everyone experiences, both on a lay level and on a.
And there's going to be some overlap, of course.
Of course, yeah.
Yep. Right.
Yeah.
And people that are moving from one to the other, right? So I can think of those who, it's well, they started off as, doctrinally, they would say, no, I hold to all of these things, but we need to deal with this, issues of, identity in various ways. And then, over the course of only a year or two, all of a sudden they're embracing all kinds of things that would firmly put them in the camp of progressive evangelicals. That's very common. But not everybody does that, right? There's categories. Right. So,
well, let's go to number 3 then.
Right. I talk about this group in my book. This is unchanged from a handful of years ago when I was writing about this. And that's the neo-Anabaptist evangelicals. So these are people who are kind of think of what's called the peace churches. These are Mennonites, Amish, that type of thing, but much more blended with an evangelical approach to religion. So that's why it's kind of neo-Anabaptist. This is These are people who are usually pacifists.
Yep.
They're egalitarian in terms of gender, anti-war, anti-military, sometimes anti-capitalist. They're not that big, but they're definitely an identifiable expression or kind of evangelicals in the United States.
Yeah, these, and they obviously they have probably the least overlap with our audience, right? These have just always, the I don't know, I associate it with the kind of more conservative Wesleyan, right? Like just these groups of the whole, like different forms of the holiness movement, and the kind of hippie folks, like what's his name? Is it Shane Claiborne?
Shane Claiborne.
He'd be a great example of the kind of neo-Anabaptist sensibility. Yes.
And so he's still around. I've seen stuff from him not that long ago. I was like, wow, he's still around. He's still talking about stuff, I guess.
Yeah. So his kind of new monasticism, I would group into this group as well. So it's really a sensibility of really emphasizing this kind of Sermon on the Mount ethics, taking it, kind of emphasizing that very heavily.
Yeah.
So being pacifistic, that type of thing.
It seems very often that there's like a kind of like chosen poverty, right? Or like at least a kind of a skewing of wealth in a certain regard.
Right. Yeah, that could be part of it.
Yeah. Great. Well, we don't, because they live monastically and they live in circles we don't frequent as much. Let's go to number 4.
Well, I don't know if this one will be much better in terms of circles you don't frequent very much, but Pentecostal and charismatic evangelicals.
Oh, well, there are so many of them, Brad. They're hard not to have friends with. So tell us about this group.
Well, this of course is a little diverse too, but I think that you can group them together in their emphasis, very strong emphasis on the continuation of certain gifts of the Holy Spirit. They're expecting to be spoken to by God. They're expecting miraculous healings. Sometimes there's an emphasis on speaking in tongues, really kind of exuberant worship. And I think many of us will be familiar with this kind of evangelical.
Yep.
Yeah. I think this is, I recently heard that charismatic Christians boast to be like a fourth of the evangelical worldwide population. And so I think that now I don't know what it is in America. Obviously that would be different, but this is, I think this is a perennial at this point. And again, it could change, of course, but this is since the 1900s. This is a perennial group and kind of person you will encounter as an evangelical. And
not always, but sometimes this is also where you would get deviations into the prosperity theology as well.
Right. It has its own different excesses than what the progressives would have. But right, this is where, obviously at the worst case, this is name it and claim it. This is Joel Osteen, that kind of stuff. And then, this more and obviously I guess, and maybe one of the reasons is interesting is there was at least an attempt with New Calvinism to bring in at least some of the charismatic sensibilities.
Mesh them a little bit.
The ones, at least the more, the ones that didn't have the kinds of excesses of the really wild stuff. Sam Storms, we're thinking about you here, right? There's that crossover.
A little bit, yeah. There's a spectrum of approaches to that. In the book, I identify them basically as a cautiously continuationist. So not full on charismatic, but there were some openness to visions and dreams, and sometimes feeling like God is calling you to do X, Y, Z, or that type of thing.
I'm so glad to hear that. I use I think we've probably talked about this, but this is obviously a doctrinal thing. I use the term of Pentecostals, charismatic, continuation, because I do think, like, whether or not theologically how different they are, it's just what they actually do, or what they say is possible maybe is very, very similar, but what they actually do at their churches, in their personal lives, is very different, right? In these groups. What number was that? I've just lost count. Was that
that was
4?
number 4.
That was 4, so
Great.
we're on 5.
Great.
5. These are roughly ordered from the most kooky to the most hardline right, just so you know.
All right. Pastor Michael, is your goal to be number 7? Is that your
We'll see. I don't know.
I guess we'll
I don't know
find out.
yet.
So number 5, I call, this is kind of a joke from survey research, called just Christians. So in social science, when you ask people, what religion do you identify as, you'll give out the normal like Catholic, evangelical type thing, and then we always include a category just Christian, because a lot of people select that,
Yeah.
and they're almost always evangelicals, but these are people who are kind of lowest common denominator Christians.
Yeah.
It's a large expression of evangelicalism in the United States. I think like the National Association of Evangelicals and a lot of other groups would kind of fall into the just Christian category. A lot of times with this type of evangelical, you're not going to, especially among the lay people, they're not going to be abreast of all the different categories or labels that are even an option for them. So if you ask them about Calvinism, they may have never even heard of Calvinism or Arminianism or all the other kind of dividing lines in evangelical Protestantism. They might not even know what a Protestant is. They might just be, identify as just a Jesus follower or just a Christian. And these people could be in all sorts of churches. They could be in Wesleyan churches, they could be in Calvinist churches, but the basic idea here is that it's a very kind of generic, lowest common denominator Christianity in the Protestant vein. But if you talk to them about what they believe, they're clearly evangelicals. So that's why I include them as
interesting.
Yeah.
So this, I would assume, and since this is based on survey, maybe you can actually give a little bit of an answer. Is this a large group of what is considered evangelicals? Like, is this one of the larger groups?
It's hard to say because there's some overlap between these 7. It's hard to say what percentage of the landscape each one occupies. But yeah, I mean, I would guess this one is not small. It's definitely much larger than the Neo-Anabaptists.
Sure.
So yeah, it's very common. I think especially among people who are not church leaders. This is especially common among lay people.
Yeah.
And this would then include probably people who have this kind of persuasion out of, I mean, one would be, again, sorry, just Christians, love you, love to have you on the show sometime, but the like out of ignorance that they just don't know. But probably there are also those who would they believe this is maybe the right posture, right? I shouldn't take any other right label, I guess, is
right. There's it could be either way, right? There's some people who just aren't informed about the various categories on the menu, and there's others who probably by conviction don't want to pick their soteriology or pick a position on the Holy Spirit or on gender issues or whatever, and they're just happy to go to church and believe in the Trinity and the resurrection and just the basics of evangelical religion.
I was thinking a lot of people, I mean, I grew up in the evangelical free church in America, and I'm just thinking of a lot of folks that are at the church now, especially in this region of the country because of influence of guys like John Piper and others, and just because of the nature of new Calvinism and how it moved through evangelicalism. I feel like that did change over time and has changed a little bit more, at least in the free church, where, thinking about the churches that I grew up being a part of. But nonetheless, I just feel like a lot of the folks that, I'm either grew up around or that I still know, just very content to hear the kind of central things. Doctrine divides, don't need to talk about anything else. Let's just keep the main thing. And, everything else can be dealt with somewhere else or maybe not at all.
Yeah. So I think it's important to remember that these people are out there and they form a large chunk of of ordinary lay people in evangelicalism.
Yeah. And I do think that probably one of the things, again, in my experience, is then they're actually either, in overall, it's this like, it's one of the reasons in evangelicalism, it's unsettling when labels or certain doctrinal distinctives are brought in and are made like important, because there is a large base of people that just want us to be just Christian, right? Like there are plenty of people in our area, in the Midwest, who would say, I love John Piper, he's a great preacher. And then if you're like, well, what about, if you want to talk to them on his positions of Calvinism or whatever else, they're like, oh, I don't know, like that's not what they care about, right? They care about just, he's an earnest, passionate, biblical teacher, and that's what they're looking for, right? If you said, would you change if he wasn't there, would you go to a PCA church or a free church? They'd go, okay, like they would not, they wouldn't, that wouldn't rattle them at all.
Yeah, and I think that's very common, and it's especially for people who are really into theology and all the distinctions. It's important to remember that a lot of, maybe especially for pastors, it's important to remember that a lot of people are like that.
Yeah, great.
Nope. I mean, I don't want to say that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah,
but yeah,
I think it is. It's just again, the reason I like it is it just explains what I see, right? It just explains.
Well, and also, can I just say, I will make some kind of judgment as a pastor and as somebody that can.
This is our job.
As a non-sociologist, let me put a value judgment. It's okay to be just a Christian. I'm not saying that this is always good, right? So we talked about how maybe there is some of it that's just out of an ignorance, and maybe sometimes that's almost like a willed ignorance, right? Like you probably should be more mature in the faith than you are at this point. But this is actually one thing that I think we've talked about. One of the problems of New Calvinism is there was this sense of everybody needs to read all of these books and know theology really, really well. And I want everybody to know theology, right? I want everybody to know, for instance, the Westminster Confession. I want you to be able to understand the truths that it exposits. But even that, that can be done in a way that's pretty basic. Not everybody has to be a theologian. Not everybody has to be the guy who's reading books all the time. You can just be a regular guy who just likes going to church, likes hearing about Jesus, how you've been forgiven of your sins, and you go home and love your family. And that's it. You don't have to get involved in all of the rest of it. That's okay.
Yeah, it is. And then, but those who, we do need those with the gift of discernment, because the just Christians are going to be ruled by one of these seven groups.
And hopefully you have a good pastor who is not just a Christian.
Okay, there we go. But it is good, right? So, all right.
And I think you do see some megachurch pastors who kind of preach the just Christian.
Yes, I was thinking of a lot of megachurches when you were saying that. Actually,
this is the megachurch brand, because to be the megachurch, you have to. How else do you hold together
broad appeal?
2,000
broad
people?
appeal.
Yeah. So there is, again, the faithful Michael. We have to the two ends even of this group, right? The faithful grandma Michael just said, who spends lots of time in prayer, isn't interested in these kinds of things, and she's very different than the megachurch pastor who says just all we need is Jesus, and we don't need any of those other things in here. So that's some wild diversity. So, all right, get us further to the right, Brad, with number 6.
Right. So number 6 does dive into precisely those issues that we're saying the previous category ignored or was unaware of. So these are the ones I call scholastic Protestant conservatives. That's kind of a weird label, I know.
It's a lot of big words, Brad.
Well, it's people. This is where we get into, I think, kind of where a lot of people from the New Calvinism still are. So these are people who are into all the books and the theology, and but here are conservative. So I would include. So I'll just name some, Kevin DeYoung is a great example of a Protestant conservative. Instead of scholastic, just think bookish. Okay. These are people who know the scholarship. They're aware, they're informed, they have opinions. And it's also people who, so most seminary professors at least in the Presbyterian and Baptist vein, would probably fit into this category. I would also, to the extent that conservative Lutherans can be evangelicals, I would probably say that they might fit in here too.
Huh.
But
They're at least dialogue partners with these people.
yeah, so
I don't know how they would like being called evangelicals.
Well,
They-
it was their word originally, right?
It is true.
Right. Hear
But-
that, my Lutheran friends who I know are listening. You hear that? You're you're lumped in with us too. You may not like it, but you're a part of us too.
So these are the, to put it simply, these are the seminary professor types and the lay people who are informed by them and interested in them. So if you would read, if you're a kind of an ordinary evangelical and you would read a Kevin DeYoung book, I would put you in this category. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You don't have to be a Kevin DeYoung. You just have to be interested enough in the nuances of theology and ethics and so on to have an interest in understanding the history, the scholarship, the theology, and so on. So these are people who are theologically conservative, socially and ethically conservative Christians, but also are bookish in a sense, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'll just say this. Hello, my conservative Protestant scholastics. That, Pastor Michael, I believe, would be our general people, since we have a semi-reoccurring segment called Ride or Die with KDY, where we defend something Kevin DeYoung has said that has upset.
It's true. This
other
probably
groups
hits the majority of our
evangelicals.
audience. Probably not all of them, but a majority
No.
for sure.
No,
Right. So I would put other, I mean, I don't know all the faculty at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, but I assume I would go to their website and they would all I would put them in this category, right?
Yeah.
And any lay person who would be influenced,
Yeah.
if you would go buy a J.V. Fesco book on Amazon, you're definitely in this category. Okay?
Right.
So,
this is as New Calvinism is divided, this is, for example, why things about TGC are so controversial, because they're posting articles. Now, obviously, Kevin DeYoung is not one of their writers officially anymore, but right, they're posting these kinds of articles at the same time as posting things that, at least certainly some of them have been directly would be in the vein of woke Christians, right? They're branching into these other things as well, and this is why people now all have at least our audience would have a love-hate relationship with the material being posted on the Gospel Coalition.
yeah, and I think that some of it also veers into the just Christian category a lot.
Sure.
Yep.
Now too.
It does.
This is also in this sixth category is where I should say, so third wayism would still be very much, and winsomeness would be very much valued in this category.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of the way, you know what that means.
Yeah,
So
we do. we do. And because, right, it's what the goal with those strategies is how do we present this conservative Protestantism? How do I either win over just Christians? How do I present myself to the other evangelicals? Right. That's what those kinds of strategies, communication strategies are answering. Right.
Right. It's a posture toward others, and perhaps especially non-Christians, that wants to emphasize winsomeness, kind of a non-political third way kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I would put, John Piper, Gavin Ortlund, Kevin DeYoung to an extent,
And
Michael Horton, most seminary professors and bookish type pastors, a lot of them would be here.
Reformed Theological Seminary's motto, "Winsomely Reformed," probably falls into this, as they assigned me 45 hours of lectures on Christian ethics, but they still want that. I don't think 45 hours of lectures is winsome, by the way, my RTS profs. I love you all, but that you can't. I'm going to lose some time getting through those. I think that this is Michael, do you have any thoughts, questions on our group, probably our people here?
I'm really interested to know what the next one is.
Ooh. Are
That's
you
where I'm
jumping
at.
further? You want to? All
I
right.
want to know number 7.
Right. So this seventh group, so 10 years ago, 6 was pretty much as far right as you could go in evangelicalism before you
Yeah.
came kind of a fundamentalist, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah.
But it really seems like in the last 5 years or so, there's been this new space opening between like a Kevin DeYoung, Tim Keller type, PCA. Those are both PCA guys, and fundamentalists in kind of a with whatever negative views you want to impute to fundamentalists. But there seems to be this other space opening up further to the right that I call post-liberal. Some might want to talk about nationalism here as well. So either post-liberal or nationalist Christians. By post-liberal, I don't. So in America, when we say liberal, a lot of times we think of Democrats or people on the left. But here I'm using the word liberal in the European sense, which is basically it would include both the Republicans and the Democrats in America. And it's kind of the broad liberal order where it's a public square informed by tolerance and live and let live. And everybody is free to choose what defines a good life for them, and to pursue that. So a post-liberal evangelical would be somebody who, much more so than the previous category, is seeking to make a kind of bring Christian values into the public and maybe especially the political sphere. So I think of kind of a newish website that launched, American Reformer, for example, and how that would differ from the Gospel Coalition in terms of its political kind of tenor and its willingness to say, basically, no, we're not just going to live and let live. We're going to try to enact policy that we think is for the good of our neighbors, loving our neighbors through politics, kind of.
Yeah. I wonder, so, so that's on the political end. Then, I'm thinking, at least like with American Reformer, for instance, you also see that on like other cultural fronts, right? So not just like, hey, we're going to try to change policy here, but for instance, there's been a lot of stuff that they've done recently with, is it Grove City College? Is that they kind of had a campaign that was aimed at what they seem to see as a kind of theological or just, drift of some kind, cultural drift at Grove City College. And so they helped, at least in some right, kind of push into that a little bit, right? And are still going, I assume. I don't know. I haven't super kept up with it. I think it was probably on Aaron Wren's podcast that I listened to a bit about it, and had seen stuff on the interwebs, but didn't get too involved myself. But so there you see also like another kind of cultural end of, okay, higher education, even a Christian institution, but we see some kind of cultural drift that we want to push back against actively.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're at the 7th. This is the kind of the what I call hard line, the farthest to the right, essentially. And so it's not just politics. You're right. It would be other cultural things too. So the Christians in this category would probably, even if they wouldn't use this phrase, they would be anti-woke. They would, if they saw identity grievance evangelicals having an influence at institutions of Christian higher education, they would want to point that out and combat it. This group is kind of the group that is, they are glad to move beyond what's recently been called third wayism, and they're glad to assert themselves in public, sometimes in politics, sometimes culturally, etc. But there's a much more willingness to assert a Christian view. None of these people would be, happy to vote for Democrats or something. These are
right.
But maybe they're also not in love with the Republican Party, because they're, like I said, the liberal order would include both Democrats and Republicans, and some of these people are what's the word? transgressive, I guess, politically, that they would be on the right, but they, at the end of the day, they probably would still vote for Republicans, but it would be they're much more eager and willing to say live and let live is not going to fly anymore
Yeah.
in America.
So
Right.
so is so this, it sounds almost like what's interesting is if we can say there's activism by the conservative Protestant scholastics, they're going to be like theologically active, right? They write books, they say things like, right, Albert Mohler, theology matters, right? Whereas this group seems at least to be more willing to openly assert their political and cultural, what they believe is right politically and culturally, right? They're willing to extend into these things, which, right, in some ways, I mean, it's not the first time evangelicals have done that, but right, obviously there was at least at one point a desire, as you said, to break with fundamentalists who were very much poised that way.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And here, I want to be clear. I'm not talking about fundamentalist Christians
Right.
here. This is something different than just like your run of the mill independent fundamentalist Baptists.
Yep.
It's really a kind of reawakened public or political theology among conservative evangelicals. And some of them might call themselves Christian nationalists, but I don't find that category very helpful. I prefer to frame it as like a post-liberal sensibility.
Right.
Yeah.
And obviously, who we've interviewed, our friend Stephen Wolf, right? He would fall into this group and describes himself as a Christian nationalist, but but it's not limited to people who would agree with his proposal for, Christianity in America, right? His design of it.
Right. I'm not only talking about Stephen Wolf here. But,
right. Your example was the American Reformer.
I think American Reformer would be a great example, and the people who write there. Aaron Wren, I know, was involved with American Reformer. Would probably, he's not so impressed, I think, with what's called the new right, which I think is the post-liberal right. So there's a little bit of a blurriness there. You may know the name Timon Klein. I think William Wolf, well known on Twitter, would probably be somewhere around here. Yeah.
Michael, can they pull you all the way to 7? Can they pull you off your?
I was gonna ask what you think I am.
Oh,
what do you think? Where do you think I would fit in those categories? So I will admit, it's 6 or 7.
Well, I would say, I don't know how to put this in a way that doesn't make it sound like you're hiding something. But I don't want it to feel that way. I think you're like, probably because of your vocation as a pastor, like your vocation is to teach theology and do those things, which probably means very much in like who you are with people, you're a 6.
Yeah.
But I think like my experience with you would be that you would be post-liberal in many ways. And again,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you see my life, right, like just my personal family life, how I structure my life, like the kinds of the kind of world that I am even like actively trying to build and change things for, I think you would probably firmly put me in a post-liberal camp. But I think you're right. I mean, as far as like public ministry, even just because I see there as a distinction between, hey, what is my role as a pastor? Right. And then what is my role as, maybe more just a citizen, a head of household, those sorts of things. I'm going to see those as a little bit different. So I may not be as like active, like say, like if from the pulpit, I'm not going to be, necessarily active in the same way that some might want me to be. Sure. But yeah, that's how I feel too. I think that's a pretty apt description.
Because most pastors aren't trying to bless their congregants like me with homemade soap from their homestead and fresh lard from their own animals, which is an awesome benefit of knowing you. But right, it's just that like it is just the like you've just in your lifestyle you've embraced a lot of the like those kinds of post-liberal things. Though obviously, I think in your specific vocation as a pastor, right? Whatever things may be appropriate as a cultural agenda is of course different than you being called to dispense the gospel and the word, the sacraments, right, faithfully to people, right? Which is why I think, at least publicly, that's much more going to be. And you like to read, right? And you are, and you are bookish. Look at that's what everyone says. It looks like a librarian and a homeless man podcast together now that they have that we've in the past used some videos. So there you go.
Yeah. So those are the 7 types or kinds of evangelicals I see in the United States now. What we used to, I guess, call the young, restless, reformed would probably be mostly type 6, the bookish conservative Protestants still. Some have moved in the post-liberal direction, I think. Some might have moved in the other direction and taken a more just Christian approach.
My unprofessional observation would be there are people like Kevin DeYoung who, while they don't have as much influence, they've stayed in this this conservative Protestant. There's certainly some people who frustrated with how things turned out are post-liberal, and I think then I would say that there is a large group that would make up the like cultural grievance evangelicals, right? This is the group of those people who doctrinally are perhaps where Kevin DeYoung is, but they're persuaded of certain parts of identity politics, and that has caused a rift amongst them.
Could be, yeah. I don't. You'd have to tell me which leaders those are. Maybe you don't want to, but yeah.
No, I think if you wrote the book Woke Church, you might be one of those leaders, I guess, is the perhaps.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's.
Yeah. So
right. So guys who clearly, like Eric Mason, who like was clearly connected to in some ways like a part of that new Calvinist movement, and then is now clearly, there seems to be a lot of that identity grievance, identity politics. And
obviously, like the heartache people experience over Tim Keller is debating on if he fits that category or if he's a bookish evangelical, right? Because when people see him write about culture or politics, they feel like it feels social justice-y, right? That's why there's so much heartache, I think, because when you don't fit squarely into one of these groups, then people in multiple groups, right? Because everyone wants you to fit somewhere, it seems to me, right? Like nobody cares that Shane Claiborne's still doing his thing, right? That nobody's upset about that, but right, if you're moving post-liberal, you're going too far, right? If you're leaving, that's where I think the heartache comes for people when they talk about these things.
Yeah, I see. And I probably shouldn't name names, but I can. Now that I think about it, there's people who were squarely in the kind of Gospel Coalition, New Calvinist circles 10 years ago who now view their religion through the lens of their race rather than the race through their race through the lens of their religion.
Right. It used to be and I listened to it for a number of years while I was more in the YRR group, right? This would be like Jamar Tisby's group. They were the Reformed African American Network ran, and then they became the Witness, and now Jamar Tisby works with Ibram X. Kendi, right? Like it's just a very clear it now has a very clear political, like that has that's just a political thing now. And again,
I found it funny when he got hired by Kendi that his title was Director of Narrative.
No, what a great dude, what a great title. I love titles. Brad, you need to clearly get you need to get yourself a better title as a sociologist. You need to get a very a wild title that I think would do well on whatever your next book will be. It would be a great would a great thing to have. I don't know what it would be, but
Yeah, I don't know what. Yeah.
you probably have to work for a think tank because that's where you really get the made up titles of things. But
King of American Christianity.
That's right. That's great. Well, I think there's a lot to think about here. Brad has given us already an hour of his time, and so this has been very useful. So, Brad, thanks for coming back again. I'm sure you'll say things on the internet that will make us want to ask you about them again. So, no promises. We will never ask you to talk to us again.
Oh, I would be glad to.
That's great. Well, Michael, so you can spend your afternoon and evening enjoying your 6 or 7 lifestyle, whatever that might be, and we will catch you next time. On
I hope I didn't create a new engram or something.
Oh, you probably did. There's probably
we need to build this website right now.
That would be cash money if
Somebody go make this test.
Yeah.
And it
would probably take like 5 questions. Like, do you like this person? Do you have a vow of poverty? The end. Don't need any more questions. Like, do you believe in hell? Do you believe homosexuality is a sin? Right? Like we get this pretty like
you get there pretty quick.
It's how many questions down do we need to go before we just squarely put you somewhere? Like, do you think denominations
it's
are the
probably
worst
just
thing?
7 questions, and you start with, is homosexuality sin? Okay. And then you just slowly move down.
Yeah. Do you think denominations are bad? Boom, we got you. Like, it's just, that's great. So, all right. Well, thanks, guys. This has been great. We will catch you next time. Thank you, Brad, for coming back on the show. It was a wonderful interview. We hope you will rate and review this podcast for us if you enjoyed it. And send us a message. Which of these groups are you?